So about a month ago, I got in touch with Sigma and I asked if I could borrow a lens. And they said yes, which is a welcome surprise, and they sent over this, the fabulously interesting 60-600, in this case for L mount, because I also wanted to test out some of the new features available in the Panasonic S5IIX, and I thought this would be a great opportunity. But even more so, I really wanted to test out this lens because I've shot a bunch of Sigma telephoto lenses over the years. I had 2 different copies of the 150-600 Sport for DSLR. I've shot the 150-600 for mirrorless as well, and I've never had a chance to have a go on one of these. But out of the entire range, and in fact all of the telephoto zooms on the market, this one is the most sensible to me for the sorts of photography that I do. And I say fabulously interesting because, well, it kind of is. And to go into more detail on that, let's cut away briefly to when I started filming this video 3 weeks ago on top of a mountain when it was very windy. So I'm on a mountain, it's very windy, I have an extremely precarious filming setup, and I have the Sigma 60-600. This is the perfect location for this lens, in my opinion. I mean, yes, it's probably very good at sports, but who cares about sports? What I care about are birds and epic landscapes, and I can do that in one location here in Wales because Wales is really awesome. And I'm up here to photograph stone chats, which are quite small little birds, and they pop up on the tops of all the bushes. So I have it at 600mm and I'm having a great time. But then the sun comes out even more. The sunset is happening, golden hour is upon us, and you're looking at a landscape like this, and it is really epic. And I almost fell over there because there was a bump there. Do you swap lenses? Something like a 70-200 would be ideal for this sort of landscape. But inevitably, every single time you do that, a really interesting bird will fly past and you'll have the wrong lens on. And this is always the case. Every single time I've been up here, I have the wrong thing on the camera. So maybe you bring a second camera, but that's just added weight. You have to walk up here. You have to hike that up. It's not good for your knees. It's certainly not good for my knees. And the added weight of the 60-600 over, say, the 150-600 is maybe about 500 grams. But any 70-200 lens is going to be much more than that. And you're going to potentially add a second camera body. Doesn't make sense. This makes sense. And it can't just be me that wants to photograph in this manner. So let's start by talking about some of the physical characteristics of this lens, and I'll begin with the weight. It's about 2.5 kilos, which isn't too bad in my opinion. It's a bit heavier than things like the Nikon 180-600, which I also have, but it is lighter than the 150-600 Sport for DSLR lens that I had prior to that. So in that regard, it's in a reasonable place in the lineup, and it's been improved with things like a lighter weight hood than the DSLR one, which was aluminium, I think, and this is some sort of composite plastic. Overall, I quite like that, and when it's compressed, it's quite comfortable to use. However, like the 150-600 Sport, when you extend the lens, the weight balance does move forwards. It's got a fairly large front element, you can feel the weight of it move that way. So my recommendation would be the same as it is for all telephoto lenses really, in that you should use a battery grip on your camera if you're not using a gripped body. It will move the weight balance back towards the center of your body, and that is significantly more comfortable than holding the majority of your weight in an outstretched left arm. That's my recommendation for this lens too, and it's quite comfortable if you do that. Now, a surprisingly contentious part of my Nikon 180-600 review was my disdain for the lens foot, because it was effectively useless. Well, this one's pretty good. It's quite interesting, and it's certainly a functional tripod foot. However, it is a little bit frustrating for me in that it's quite short. It's kind of comfortable to hold it and to carry it by the foot, which is something I do very regularly, but I would prefer it if it was a little bit longer. In terms of function though, I can't really argue. It's got Arca Swiss grooves already cut into it, and the collar itself has nice clicky detents as you rotate it around at 90-degree angles. That's very nice. If it was my lens and I was using it regularly, I'd probably put a longer foot on though. But at least it's easy to do, and it's just these 4 bolts in order to replace it, and Sigma actually make the feet themselves. Now, in terms of the remaining physical characteristics of this lens, I have no complaints. Like all Sigmas of recent years, it's very nicely put together. It's a nice compromise between quality feel and weight, whereas some of their older lenses tended to be quite heavy because they focus so much on the quality feel. This is a much better sort of area to be in. The weight isn't too bad. It feels really, really nice. But it is an extending zoom lens, and some people don't tend to like that sort of thing. And now, I'm not worried about the weather sealing on this lens, and neither is Sigma. They did tell me I could just go off and shoot it in the rain, though we've had uncharacteristically sunny weather here the last 3 weeks or so, and I've not managed to shoot it in the rain at all, although at least my insurers will be happy. But it does have one bonus, in that if this was a fixed size lens and it still had this zoom range of 60 to 600, well, you'd have to use the zoom ring in order to extend it. And that's a bit of a challenge. To do it in one movement, especially when you're holding the weight of the camera, I can only get to about 200, 250 comfortably before having to do another rotation. But all recent Sigma zoom telephoto lenses can be push-pulled as well. They have a nice bit of shaped barrel at this end. It's intended to do that, and it's a very, very nice feature to have. If you're that sort of nutter who wants to crash zoom from 60 to 600, this is clearly the lens for you. So let's take a little bit of a look at the optical performance of this Sigma lens. Now, when I was coming into making this video, I had some expectations. I was expecting this lens to perform worse than competitors in its price range, because that's logical. It does more. It's a 10 times zoom. It's got more lens elements. It would make total sense for it to be a little bit less sharp, perform slightly worse than, say, the Nikon 180 to 600. And I'm using that as a comparison because I own it. And it's not a perfect comparison because I can't shoot them on the same camera body. They're not even available for the same lens mount. That's obviously a flaw in my testing here, but it's the lens that I have, and it presented me with a fairly confusing conclusion, shooting similar subjects with these two setups. Why was the result from the Sigma just as good, if not nicer, than that coming out of the Nikon setup? It's half the resolution. It's a lens that probably shouldn't perform as well. But I think the results in the real world from this lens are very, very good. Take a look at this photo of a pigeon. Fantastic feather detail, fantastic colour, nice contrast. It's performing really, really well. Now, this was a close-up shot. Here's a longer distance shot. Again, rendering really nicely, clear detail. It's performing really well. Now, I don't like lens charts. I don't find them useful. They're not useful. They're not usually an accurate representation of how a lens performs in the real world, because me photographing a chart in my kitchen 3 meters from the camera on a tripod means nothing compared to shooting a real life subject that's 10 meters away. It doesn't work that way. Lenses can perform differently at different focal lengths and at different focus distances, which is what I meant to say. So the real world results are the ones to use, really. But I was really curious, why does this lens perform seemingly better than my Nikon 180 to 600? Well, it's kind of interesting. Okay, so I've loaded some test shots into Photolab. I've got no optical corrections applied. I have merely upped the brightness so that these are a little bit easier to see. And we're going to start with this photo from the 60-600 and compare it to one from the Nikon Z9. Now, something to keep in mind with this is that these are two different cameras, two different lenses, and therefore they're probably not mounted exactly the same on the tripod, even though I kept the tripod in the same place. For potentially this reason, that's why they are framed differently, although the Z9 is wonky because I apparently just have a wonky head, and I thought that was level. But it's probably that. This isn't very scientific, unfortunately. I would need the same camera body mounted to the tripod in exactly the same way and then to be able to hot swap the lenses, and that's just not possible at the moment. Now, the results are kind of interesting because at first glance, the Sigma certainly looks less sharp than the Nikon. But that's not necessarily the case, and it's kind of interesting looking at these two, having previously done some testing of the Nikon lens, because I think that the Nikon 180-600 is sharper across the frame than the Sigma 150-600 DSLR lens that I was using previously. I tested these against each other. I think that Sigma DSLR lens was sharper in the center, but that the Nikon was overall sharper across the frame. But in this photo from the Nikon, I can definitely see that it does drop off towards the edges. But the Sigma is actually quite a bit more consistent. However, it gets even more interesting than that. Now, when we zoom in, you can certainly see when swapping between the two that the Nikon looks sharper, in the center in particular. But that's not the whole story, because when you're looking in the center of the Sigma, well, there's something missing. The Nikon has really quite strong chromatic aberration all over the frame, particularly in the center, and as you go off to the edges, it's extremely pronounced. Now, looking at the Sigma photo, when you go back to the center, well, there's none at all. And this is very, very interesting, because even though the Nikon lens appears to be sharper, in many use cases, it actually is almost a disconcerting sharpness, because it does have discoloration around these defined shapes, and this does affect the photo quality. And so even though the Sigma appears to be less sharp in the center, it doesn't really look like that in real life. They appear almost equal, or effectively equal, because there's far less of this color fringing that actually makes what look to be sharp objects look a little bit weird. I think that's very, very interesting. But when you look at a real life subject, so no one's photographing text with this lens, I think that the difference between the two lenses is exceptionally minimal. Now let's take a look at a more realistic subject, namely this photorealistic bird. Isn't he lovely? This is taken on the Nikon, and it looks very nice. But when we look at the Sigma, well, there's no real difference to me. Again, you're seeing that slight distance variation, and the colours are quite notably different, partly down to the camera, but partly I think that the Sigma renders colours a little bit differently. And there is no difference in terms of perceivable detail in these two photos to my eye. This was taken using the high-res mode on the Panasonic, so this is actually twice the resolution of the Z9 at this point. But I do have a comparison without that as well, and you can see the difference in detail when you zoom in between these two shots. So higher resolution, lower resolution, and then on the Nikon, they all perform very, very similarly, and I can't pick between these two lenses in terms of this quality, because even if the Sigma is technically less sharp, without that chromatic aberration in the center in particular, it renders just as cleanly, and they are effectively equivalent. And I think that's very interesting. So my conclusion is that yes, this lens is technically slightly less sharp than the Nikon 180-600, but in real world usage, there's nothing between them. And that's very, very impressive from the Sigma. There are a couple of other things that I want to test on the Sigma 60-600, and that is birds in flight photography and its use with teleconverters, because on the L-mount version of the lens you can attach teleconverters, and Sigma sent over both the 1.4 times and the 2 times teleconverter. So let's go and give it a go. I'm really curious to see how it works. So I found a nice secluded spot for a couple of minutes next to a weirdly perched jackdaw and a couple of nesting swans to talk about the experience with the teleconverters so far. And optically, very impressed. More impressed than I was with the Nikon Z teleconverter with the 180-600, which I made a video about if you haven't seen it. That tended to focus on the problems caused by using a teleconverter, and they exacerbates optical problems in a lens. But I'm not seeing any problems, at least not on the camera, with this combination of the 1.4 or the 2 times with the 60-600 and the S5IIX. Optically it seems to be performing very well, but the experience of using this combination is very, very frustrating. And it's not the fault of Sigma, as far as I can tell. The Panasonic S5IIX is by far and away the worst performing camera I have ever used with a teleconverter setup. I don't know what's going on. It feels like it can't phase detect autofocus anymore when the maximum aperture is f9. It's incredible how bad it is. I had better experiences with the Canon 7D Mark II with a 1.4 times teleconverter on the Sigma 150-600 Sport from the DSLR days. There is something flawed in this camera. It can't focus very accurately. It pulsates like depth from defocus, which shouldn't be happening in phase detect. It drifts in and out from near to far and near to far over and over again. It can't maintain focus on anything, no matter how sticky you have the autofocus settings. It cannot do it. It's immensely frustrating, and it's significantly worse than if you weren't using the teleconverter. So it's something very strange with the camera, and I have never experienced anything quite like this on another camera, mirrorless or DSLR. So in that regard, it's frustrating, because it's a frustrating shooting experience. It's very hard to get the camera to lock onto things. Moving subjects are out. You definitely can't do birds in flight photography with it, and I can do that and have done that with teleconverters on other systems. But if you can get it in focus, the optical quality of the photos is very good, and so maybe there's still a use case for it, but it is a bit of a frustration, because right now I think this is probably the most viable L-mount wildlife camera. It's the only one that's got phase detect autofocus, that can do burst photography, things like that. It's very frustrating that this is your only choice and it doesn't really perform right in this situation. The mount needs some better options in terms of cameras. And it's kind of a similar story when it comes to birds in flight, and there's an extremely noisy pair of geese behind me. The lens is performing superbly, it's fast, it's accurate, it has linear focus motors, it's everything you want, and it performs very comparably to other lenses of this type. But it is being let down by the camera, which really struggles in terms of focusing quickly as the bird is closing distance to you. And that's not really something that the lens can do anything about. But in the areas where the lens does affect the performance, it's very, very good, and I'm very impressed by it. And I'll save my critique of how the S5IIX is performing in this regard for another video. So a conclusion then of my thoughts on the 60-600, which has now made its way back to Sigma. And I came into this review having already been exposed to numerous other reviews of this lens, and the sort of general gist I was getting from them was that it's a very nice lens, but you can save some money and get the 150 to 600 instead. Well, yes, that is technically the case, and if you only ever shoot it at 600 and you're looking for a bit of a bargain, yeah, makes total sense. But if you're somebody who shoots other things, if you shoot landscapes, you shoot nature, you shoot closer, you shoot woodland photography, these sorts of things, this lens has so much to offer, saving you having to buy a second lens like a 70 to 200, unless you really need a constant f4 or 2.8 aperture. For wildlife/landscape photography, which is what I do a lot of, it makes total sense. But there is a downside, and that's not the price, which I think is okay. I think it's competitive with other lenses, and it's not the weight, which is still lighter than the DSLR lenses that I used in the past. It's that it's available on Sony E mount and the Leica L mount. Now, on the Sony mount, it's hobbled by Sony, artificially so. They limit third-party lenses to a max of 15 FPS, and they don't allow teleconverters. That's a bit of a bummer. For Sony shooters in particular, it limits your options, although, to be fair, the Sony cameras that can actually shoot more than 15 FPS, those people must have the budget for the £14,000 prime lenses anyway, so maybe it doesn't really matter. And the L mount is frustrating in a totally different way. You gain that flexibility. It's technically not limited in any way in terms of its burst rate. You can use teleconverters. But that's a moot point because there's no L mount camera that can even shoot that fast, and the autofocus of the best performing autofocusing camera on the L mount isn't good enough to use with teleconverters. It's a frustrating situation to be in. There is no wildlife camera in the L mount that I would personally use for my wildlife photography. So I shoot a lot of action wildlife photography, birds in flight. I like doing that sort of thing. And for my use case, there's not a camera in the L mount that I would buy for that. Now, that's not to say that this can't work for you. If you don't shoot birds in flight, you don't shoot action photography, those sorts of things, this is a great option. And put on a Panasonic S5IIX, for example, it works really well. But I'd love to see it available for other lens mounts. Z mount would be my selfish choice because A, I shoot it, but B, a lot of wildlife photographers shoot Nikon cameras, particularly Z mount cameras now. It's a very appealing platform. Things like the Z8 are fantastically popular in the wildlife community. I would love to see this lens available for the Z mount. But then the big question is, would I replace my 180 to 600 with it? Well, yeah. It's so flexible, and it is an improvement for me in terms of the things that I shoot. I would be really curious to test it out on the Z9. I would love to be able to do a direct comparison between the two. I'd love to know exactly how sharp they are in comparison to each other. But from my testing on these two copies of these lenses on the camera bodies I have, the Sigma 60-600 has performed fantastically, even at half the resolution. So I guess that's my conclusion, that I love this lens and I'd love to be able to buy it on the camera system that I would like to use it on. But what are your thoughts? I'd be really interested to know, because this is a bit of an odd lens. Maybe I'm fairly weird in the types of wildlife and combined landscape wildlife photography that I like to do. Please let me know. I'd love to know your thoughts and whether you would use this lens, what you would buy instead. If you've tested this lens, please do put them down in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.